While the world has been watching the genocide in Gaza with horror, Israeli settlers have been running amok on the West Bank, backed by the Israeli military, the IDF. As of early December, 227 Palestinians had been killed by the IDF in the West Bank in 2025. Nearly half those deaths were recorded in and around Jenin and Nablus. In early December, Israeli operations in the governorates of Jenin and Tubas affected more than 95,000 Palestinians. In Tubas, raids and curfews were accompanied by the use of bulldozers to damage homes, roads and water networks, displacing families and cutting water supplies to nearly 17,000 people. Alongside this, settlers are carrying out violence, confident that the state is behind them. In the first 11 months of 2025, there were 1,680 settler attacks across more than 270 communities, an average of 5 per day. A particular target has been the olive harvest season, marked by widespread assaults on farmers, trees, and agricultural infrastructure. To discuss the Israeli horror on the West Bank, I'm joined by Professor Penny Green. Penny is a professor at Queen Mary University of London, the director of the International State Crime Initiative, and editor of the State Crime Journal, and she's recently returned from the West Bank. You're listening to The Sound of Solidarity, brought to you by Solidarity. We're a revolutionary socialist group in Australia, and if you'd like to find out more about us, our website is solidarity.net.au. I'm David Glanz, and I'm recording this episode on unceded Wurundjeri land in Naarm or Melbourne. So welcome, Penny.
Thank you, David. It's a pleasure to be here.
In my intro, I gave a snapshot of some of the violence against Palestinians being carried out in the West Bank. What did you see during your time there?
Well, I think what I saw was a very, very clear image of the genocide continuing, the genocide being perpetrated not simply against Palestinians in Gaza, but the West Bank, indeed, and in East Jerusalem. East Jerusalem and the occupied West Bank have always been part of Israel's colonial project to drive Palestinians from the land. But our attention has naturally been focused on Gaza. I mean, while the Israelis have wreaked absolute catastrophe on the people of the Strip. But in the West Bank, what October the 7th allowed Israel to do was to ramp up all of its settler colonial terror in the occupied East Jerusalem areas of perhaps, say, Silwan and Sheikh Jarrah, but very specifically in the West Bank. And I think the terror, what we saw, I think, in January of this year was the initiation of Operation Iron Wall. You mentioned Jenin camp and Tulkarm, but it also includes Nur Shams. And I visited those camps and saw the utter destruction. I mean, what struck me was that this was absolutely Gaza in the north of the West Bank. So I'll come back to that later. But the other things that I witnessed was a sort of an exponential increase in the settlement project. In fact, Israel has just approved the legalization of or construction of 49 new settlements, so in effect advancing de facto sovereignty. And Smotrich, Israel's finance minister, himself a settler, has just announced plans approving more than 3,400 homes for the E1, the East 1 settlement project, which basically connects thousands of illegal settlements in occupied East Jerusalem to the Ma'ale Admon settlement block in the occupied West Bank. So physically isolating Palestinians in East Jerusalem from Palestinians in the West Bank. So that's very visible. And even driving from Ramallah to the north of the West Bank, you see the new settlements and outposts. You also see, there's brand new, very large Israeli flags every 10 meters on the highway from Ramallah towards the north for probably something like 50 kilometers. I didn't measure it, but it was such a kind of an intimidatory experience to see these flags. What else did I see? I saw the village of Sinjar as we passed it, a beautiful Palestinian village on a hill, now completely barricaded by some, I'd say 30 meters high of razor wire, just extensive razor wire. And so the village now, this very famous Palestinian village, has now been cut off. There are two massive bright yellow barricaded gates on the two remaining entrances of the village. So you see the increasing settlement project, but at the same time you see increasing restrictions on Palestinian villages, a depopulation of Palestinian villages. In Hebron, which is divided into H1 and H2, H2 has always been the site of the most deranged and violent settlers, Israeli settlers. And Palestinians hung on and clung on. Their shops were all closed. Their facilities were all denied. And now H2 is effectively being depopulated of Palestinians, which is the ultimate goal of Israel, and the settlers are, if you like, the frontline soldiers in that project. In places like Jerusalem, you see families out for a walk during Shabbat, right? Wheeling pushchairs, but with M16s over their shoulders. I saw joggers out with holsters and pistols very openly. Israeli Jews are openly displaying this militarized version of their lives. So it's, in effect, what I see is that a ramping up of the genocide inside the West Bank. It's a terrifying scenario. I didn't witness, but in areas that I traveled on, hours beforehand, children had been murdered by IOF snipers, targeted and eliminated. They're young teenagers. This was in the area between the Calandia crossing, and Ramallah. It's an extremely shocking experience to travel in the West Bank, because here you see apartheid in its most grotesque form. You see the wall that is used to cut off Palestinian communities from each other. The wall cuts through. It's a land grabbing exercise, as well as an exercise in fragmenting Palestinian communities. There are checkpoints everywhere. There are barricades everywhere. Palestinians are forced to use very rough roads while they can see direct routes, settlement highways, which they are not allowed to travel on. And if they do, they'll be shot at. So you have this whole apartheid system of roads and tunnels, and Palestinians will be forced. Before the wall, it would take them maybe 10 minutes, 20 minutes to get from A to B. Now it will take them 3 hours, 6 hours, or they won't be able to travel because the Israelis, on a whim, will close the gates, will barricade them in. So it's a form of apartheid which I don't think we've ever witnessed before in history, so extreme. But all of these things together are part of Israel's genocidal project, part of its genocidal settler colonial project to drive Palestinians from their traditional lands. And so basically, I would say that's what I saw. But I also saw Palestinian resilience, Palestinian non-violent forms of resistance. Just existing is resistance in occupied Palestine.
You talk about Palestinians being dispossessed and driven out of their villages and off their land. Where are they going to? Are they simply crowding together with family and relatives elsewhere in the West Bank? Or are we seeing any kind of flow of Palestinians over the river into Jordan, seeking respite there?
I think there may be some. I don't have the statistics for that, David, but I certainly, when I visited the camps of Nur Shams and Tulkarm, which along with Jenin were completely depopulated. There were mass evictions. Houses were bombed. They are bomb sites. These camps now, and they were effectively villages full of refugees. So some 40,000 now have been forcibly displaced. Those people, some of the people I met were sheltering, and they have been sheltering since January 2025, in schools, in mosques, in wedding halls, in disused youth centres, with family, with friends. They are just sheltering. They haven't been allowed back to their homes. Many of the homes have been completely destroyed. 2-metre laneways were expanded into 12-metre tank-friendly roads, and all of the houses in the way were exploded. People were given absolutely no time to gather any belongings when they left. And so I visited one school in particular, a disused school, a school that wasn't ready to be populated by children. There are now 23 families living in this school, 122 people. They have one washing machine between them. There are 4 toilets in a school toilet block on the ground floor. Most of these people are on the first or the second floor. And they have one shower. So people describe lining up to access the shower. They are living half lives. I mean, this is part of the dehumanizing process that Israel inflicts on Palestinians. So I think most people, don't have the resource to go abroad. Most people, unless they're explicitly middle class and are able to travel freely, most Palestinians don't have the ability to travel freely. Israel won't allow them. Israel controls every point of exit from the West Bank and Jerusalem. So most Palestinians will be staying in the occupied West Bank because they have no alternative.
In October 2025, the Knesset, which is the Israeli parliament, voted for a bill to impose Israeli sovereignty on the West Bank, in other words, to annex it. Now, the vote was just a procedural one, so it wasn't actually a vote for annexation, but it gives an insight into what many in Israel want to see happen. Do you think annexation is imminent, and what would the consequences be?
The West Bank has been annexed. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Given what I've just said, in effect, the West Bank has been annexed. The massive increase in the settlement project, over 800,000 settlers, I think it must be closer to 900,000 now, settlers in the West Bank, connected by, as I mentioned, these apartheid roads, the quick freeways to Jerusalem and Tel Aviv that only settlers are allowed to travel on. Their illegal settlements are all connected, and where Palestinians are basically they're confined to bantustans. The West Bank is like an archipelago of Palestinian villages which are almost impossible for each other to access. When I traveled to villages in the West Bank, my driver was constantly obstructed by the yellow gates, by inaccessibility, by the immense traffic that is produced as a result of the inability for Palestinians to actually drive freely in their own land. I think that the depopulation of Palestinian villages that I mentioned earlier, especially with places like H2, this all speaks of annexation. And so Israel may formalize it in the future, but in effect, the West Bank has been annexed. I don't think there's any doubt about that.
Okay. You're a professor of law and you specialise in state crimes. So what crimes is Israel committing, and how important do you see the BDS campaign in this context? So that's boycott, divestment and sanctions.
I think that Israel is committing a whole raft of the most egregious crimes that exist in our world. They are committing genocide. I think we can look to the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, and their preliminary determination. But any genocide scholar, and I'm a genocide scholar, recognizes that Israel is committing genocide. They want to destroy in whole or part a people on the basis of their ethnicity. There is absolutely no doubt that Israel is committing genocide. As part of its genocidal project, it has committed the crime of apartheid, the crime of illegal occupation. It commits murder on an hourly basis in Gaza and the West Bank. It commits every crime under the sun, and then, of course, its soldiers engage in offences of theft. I mean, one of the women I interviewed who'd been forcibly displaced from her home in the camp of Nur Shams, which was completely, if you like, people were expelled. Everybody was expelled from Nur Shams camp. In front of her, the Israelis opened her purse, removed 2,500 shekel. They stole her. She had two gold rings and a gold bracelet, all stolen. And so that's at the lowest level, but at the highest level, genocide is being committed. And basically, the international community has enabled this genocide, has collaborated in this genocide, particularly the United States and countries like Germany and the United Kingdom. But every crime that is possible to commit by a state has been committed by Israel. In terms of how we, as an international solidarity movement, combat, I think BDS is a very effective means of isolating Israel. Certainly in the academic community, Israelis themselves, Israeli academics, there have been several articles in Haaretz, the equivalent of The Guardian, I guess, a sort of vaguely liberal newspaper. But academics there have been writing about how isolated they feel, how they, as I understand, for some extraordinary reason that we can, of course, understand, Israel is a member of the European Research Council because it sees itself as a European country, and so does the rest of Europe see it as a European country. Israel extraordinarily was getting something like the hit rate, the success rate for European grants is around 8%, 8 to 12%. Israeli scholars were achieving 25% success rate. It's now come down to around the average of 8 to 12%. Israelis are being isolated in terms of not being invited to conferences. They are excluded from collaborative projects. Universities around the world don't want anything to do with Israeli institutions. And so that is having an impact. I think there's been less impact on, my local supermarket, Waitrose, continues to stock Israeli avocados and Israeli dates. No matter what we do, that continues. And so I think that we need more traction with the BDS movement. But I think it has had an impact. But I don't think BDS alone. I think we've seen that BDS alone cannot achieve an end to this genocide, an end to Israeli settler colonialism and apartheid. Um, and that means that, unlike every other, people have recognized the Palestinian state. Many, Australia has recognized the Palestinian statehood, whatever that means in reality. States tend to have armies. Palestine doesn't have an army. The Palestinians don't have an army. There's been small degrees of armed resistance, and that is the pretext on which Israel destroyed the camps of Jenin, Tulkarm, and Nur Shams. But it seems that because historically Palestinians have always engaged in non-violent protest, with the building of the wall, every Friday Palestinians would gather at the site where the wall was being built to protest against the building of the wall. Many non-violent protesters were shot by the Israeli occupying forces. So non-violent protest has been treated as if it was a violent protest. So I think that at this stage, BDS is our best non-violent way forward, but I think it needs to be ramped up considerably.
You were in the West Bank carrying out research, as you mentioned. When and why did you begin academic work in Palestine?
About 15 years ago, I was asked to look at the situation of Palestinians in 48, so Palestinians in what is called Israel, and particularly in relation to house demolitions and forced evictions, because it was a very kind of silent, if you like, mode of repression. So Palestinians, Bedouins in the Nakab Desert their villages were being attacked and destroyed. I mean, the village of Al-Araqib, I cannot tell you how many times it's been destroyed, well over 350 times. It's a kind of it's a performative act by the Israelis that they destroy the villagers rebuild, the Israelis destroy. But many villages in the Nakab have been destroyed, and the idea was that Israel wanted to force all the Bedouin into town centres in the areas of occupied East Jerusalem of Silwan and Sheikh Jarrah. Palestinians have been the subject of settler invasions and house demolitions. Palestinians in the West Bank and occupied East Jerusalem who tried to build, because in 99% of cases, Palestinians are always denied permission to building permits to extend their homes as their families grow. They've never been able to legitimately add to their homes or to build new homes. So they build homes regardless, or they extend their homes regardless without permission. And then the Israelis issue them with demolition orders. And so I was invited to do this research for Middle East Monitor, and that was the project that first began my research interest in Palestine.
And how difficult is it to get to the West Bank, given the practical and semi-legal control of Israel? And did you go into the areas, the very small areas, controlled by the Palestinian Authority, and did you detect a difference there?
Well, I think it's really important to say that the Palestinian Authority are loathed and despised by Palestinians. They are absolutely seen as collaborators, and they themselves have been involved in shooting Palestinians in some of these raids that are associated with Operation Iron Wall. It depends. If you travel through Jordan, it's quite a journey to get into Palestine, and you never know if you'll be allowed in. Israelis control all access into and out of Palestinian territories. Um, it's true that when you are in, um, you can travel, but you are always confronted by Israeli checkpoints. Whenever you want to move from a Palestinian village to another Palestinian village, you are confronted by the wall or by checkpoints or by barriers, these yellow barriers I described earlier. So traveling is a living nightmare for Palestinians on a daily basis. And Palestinians who work in Jerusalem, for those Palestinians fortunate enough to work in Jerusalem, and by seen as fortunate enough, at Kalandia checkpoint, they will get there at midnight in order to be at work by 8 a.m. because that they are corralled into, they're like cattle pens and then cattle tunnels, metal tunnels where they are completely imprisoned, and they're let through a turnstile two at a time. And I've done this myself on different occasions. It's both a humiliating experience and unbelievably time consuming. So in order to be at work on time, Palestinians will be there hours at the checkpoint earlier in order to make it. So movement within the West Bank is extremely difficult, and people have to factor this in. And I do remember being at Birzeit University and speaking to a colleague who was working in Bethlehem. This is some years ago, and lived in Bethlehem. And she had to leave at 3 o'clock because if she didn't leave now, she'd have to try and access the settler roads, which were extremely dangerous, and she'd be shot at. So she had to leave at 3 o'clock in order to try to be home by 6. And this is a journey that should take 20 minutes. When it's interesting to go to Ramallah, one feels a lightness because Ramallah is controlled by the Palestinian Authority, and there are no Israelis inside Ramallah. So that in itself feels lighter. But it's also a bubble. And Palestinians in East Jerusalem and Palestinians elsewhere in the West Bank will talk about the bubble that Ramallah is. But nonetheless, you can certainly experience a sense in which you don't feel the heavy hand of repression in every minute of your experience.
Now, you were involved in organising the recent Gaza Tribunal, and I'll put a link to its page in the show notes. Can you tell us about the Gaza Tribunal and what you and your colleagues were hoping to achieve and what your findings were?
Yes, certainly. We established the Gaza Tribunal over 18 months ago now, led by Professor Richard Falk, who has a very close association with Queen Mary, the university which I work in London. He was at Princeton for 40 years. And Richard is one of those extraordinary intellectuals who has been steadfast in his support for the Palestinian people. He was the UN Special Rapporteur for the occupied Palestinian territories for 6 years, some years ago. Richard and a number of us established the Gaza Tribunal in order to do two things. The first was to, if you like, animate to some degree the global solidarity movement, but very significantly to create an archive of testimony and expert evidence about the genocide, focusing primarily on Gaza at this stage, but to gather as much testimony and evidence, background evidence as well, so the historical, so people like Avi Shleim, who has written so extensively and brilliantly on Zionism, but Palestinians from Gaza who have been working tirelessly to relay information, journalists and academics and creatives and those people who are agriculturalists, doctors, to gather all of the testimony that they have at their fingertips and what they've experienced, to have all this in one place, to have a record, a really detailed record of how this genocide evolved and the way it was articulated. So that's an extreme. The archive is an extremely important element of the work of the Gaza Tribunal, and that's an ongoing project, and that will take some considerable time. But it means that the tribunal continues to operate. We are also linking to a number of tribunals that have been held around the world, and if you like, they're complicity tribunals. There was a tribunal held in London, led by Jeremy Corbyn, which was about British complicity in the genocide. There was a tribunal in Toronto, Canada, led by Aziza Kanji, and that's again a complicity tribunal, Canada's complicity in the genocide. So our Gaza Tribunal is trying to bring together the complicity tribunals, along with the work that we did. We held two major hearings. The first one was in Sarajevo in June, which again brought together a range of experts looking at the elements of genocide, ecocide, domicide, the attacks on hospitals and medical professionals, those who are working on the environment and agriculture, those who work on starvation, another element of Israel's genocide in relation to Gaza. So we had a range of experts and a range of witnesses from Gaza who gave testimony. And in the final session in Istanbul, it was further testimony, again in relation to all of the elements of genocide, but this time before a jury of conscience led by Professor Christine Chinkin from the London School of Economics. And from that hearing, that final hearing, the jury produced a very powerful statement on the genocide. I mean, I should also say that the Gaza Tribunal began from the position that we weren't establishing whether or not this was a genocide. We began on the premise that it was genocide. There was no doubt that it's genocide. Now, the international courts operate very slowly. They have no powers to basically enforcement powers. They can issue warnings, and as they have done in relation to the Rohingya genocide to Myanmar. But as we know, they take decades to operate, and then they have no enforcement powers. So they are largely symbolic. And so we see the work of the Gaza Tribunal as, if you like, running parallel, in part supporting those international legal mechanisms. But, from my position, I have very little faith in the legal mechanisms, the international legal mechanisms, historically and currently. And one of the things that I have issues with them over is that they place power and authority in the hands of courts and lawyers and experts. They don't embrace civil society. People's tribunals historically are a civil society initiative, and I think, to be honest, if we're tackling any form of state crime, civil society is the most powerful agency that we have, and it's complicated. I'm not saying that civil society is always on the right side of history, but largely it is. And I think that what we have with civil society, the reason we know about the genocide in Palestine and what has happened in Gaza is because of Palestinian civil society organizations like Al-Haq, Adalah, Gazan Voices. That's how we know about genocide. That's how we know about apartheid. We have these organizations inside the oppressive state of Israel, or the occupied Palestine. And these organizations have been telling us for decades about what Israel has been doing, the crimes Israel has been committing. So it's not the court won't tell us this. I mean, they will use that data, the data that we have. They will draw on the data that we have. but it's Palestinian civil society and the civil society allies around the world who have collected the evidence, and they're the ones who've named these crimes as genocide, settler colonialism, and apartheid. And so my faith is always in civil society as a mechanism which has the greatest power to challenge the world's worst crimes. If I wanted to sum up, I think the Gaza Tribunal, I hope that the legacy of the Gaza Tribunal will be the archive. And the archive will be one that can be drawn upon by scholars, by journalists, by civil society in the future. And hopefully it will be a lasting testament.
Very much so. Amongst the evidence you heard from civil society was evidence from people who took part in the Sumud flotilla, which gathered enormous enthusiasm amongst activists and in the movement in Australia and probably, I'm sure, elsewhere around the world. How significant do you think the impact of the flotilla was?
I think it was very significant. I mean, you can see Israel's response to the flotilla. Israel treated the members of the flotilla with brutality, with absolute disregard for their rights. They knew that the nations from which members of the flotilla came from would do nothing to defend their members, and they didn't. I mean, and when we hear the testimony of those who were eventually released from Israel's vile torture centres, it's horrendous. But as they all said, this is nothing compared to what the Palestinians experience. And of course, we're hearing, because of people like Sahar Francis and those Palestinians who record what happens in Palestinian prisons, and because of the testimony that brave Palestinian journalists have gathered from these incredibly courageous prisoners who've now been released, of the rape, of the torture. It's endemic within Israeli prisons for Palestinian people. So the Sumud flotilla really angered Netanyahu and the Israeli politicians and the Israeli armed forces. And we can look at the treatment of the flotilla members to actually gauge just how much. They didn't ignore the flotilla participants. They didn't just deport them. They imprisoned them. They tortured them. They stole from them. So I think that the flotilla was a very significant element of civil society resistance to this genocide. I'm a part of the solidarity movement, which had a great deal of traction. So I think, yes, I think the flotilla had a very significant impact.
Now, Sumud, as many of us have learned in the last few months or year or so, is the Arabic word for steadfastness. It's actually a word you used earlier in the conversation. And Palestinians have shown enormous sumud, not just since the 7th of October, but for generations now, more than 100 years. What are you hearing from Palestinian colleagues and friends? Can they see a way forward? Who do they think will assist them in achieving liberation? How important is the global solidarity movement that you and I and all the listeners are part of? How important is what we do as part of the struggle for Palestine?
Well, everywhere one travels in the occupied territories, you see Sumud. The continuing existence of the Palestinian people is an example of Sumud, just getting on with life. In Gaza, what we've seen is that Palestinians start to rebuild instantly, that they have the opportunity to rebuild. They create makeshift clinics so that they can treat their family, friends, colleagues, and other Gazans. In the West Bank, and so many people I spoke to who had been forcibly displaced from Nur Shams, Jenin, Tulkarm, they used this term. We will go back to the rubble. We will continue to live in the rubble. We will go back. All we want to do is to go back amongst the rubble. Now, whether or not this is realistic, the sentiment expressed is true of those people in those camps today as it was of the villagers of Al-Araqib who continue to rebuild their village. Doesn't matter that the Israelis destroy it over 300 times over the course of a number of years. They will rebuild. Palestinians are so deeply enmeshed and entrenched to the land of Palestine that they will not be driven away by Israeli repression. Israel has tried everything in its power to destroy the Palestinians, and still it hasn't achieved that aim. The Gazans are still there. The Gazans are still there, and they are rebuilding, and they are committed to living in Palestine. When you talk to people about where they're from, in places like the Nur Shams camp or Tulkarm, they will say Haifa. They will name the villages that they were expelled from or their families were expelled from in 1948. So Palestinians will not be defeated. Sumud is in the DNA of the Palestinian people. The solidarity movement is really important. I mean, to be honest, when one goes on the marches, the national marches here in the United Kingdom, and we're in London and we're marching, and it makes us feel better. But we think, really after 26 months, what impact are we having? I send photographs to my friends in Palestine whenever we're on those marches, and it gives them a little lift. They know that they're not alone. So even that small uplift of Palestinian emotion is important. So I think that we have to work harder. I think that there is a much bigger job to do. People still talk about Israel's right to self-defense, though Israel has no legal right to self-defense because they are a belligerent occupier, and the people who are occupied they're the ones who have the right to self-defense. The Palestinians have a right to self-defense. So there is still an entrenched view about Israel, though I think it's breaking down. I think that what we've seen is that globally, ordinary people around the world have enormous sympathy with the Palestinian people, and they are appalled by the Israeli state. Yet they don't know what to do. But we've seen our leaders who continue to enable Israel, who continue to support its arms industry, who continue to send parts for the F-35 fighter jets, who continue to fund Israel's genocidal project, who continue to suppress Palestinian activism around the world. We have political prisoners now on hunger strikes who are near death in the UK, and the Labour government here will say nothing and do nothing. So I think that we have this very, very real division between the ruled and the rulers, and between the global north and the global south. We have to work much harder. It's because Israeli Hasbara has been so powerful, Israeli propaganda, and because our own governments have been have fallen over backwards to defend this violent criminal state. They've created it at the same time, and they are defending their creation. But I think that the solidarity movement has to work harder. It has to work much harder. And in what ways? That's not easy to say, but we somehow have to win the propaganda war, and in ways that we haven't necessarily achieved thus far.
And I think we can all take inspiration from the general strikes for Palestine in Italy and Greece. They're way ahead of what we in Australia are capable of delivering, but I think that sets the bar high. That's the kind of solidarity that can perhaps really make a difference.
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, the most successful elements of the BDS movement have been when workers have prevented the movement of armament shipments and so on. The general strikes in Italy, very interesting. Italy is led by a fascist. Yet the people of Italy, the ordinary workers in Italy, have been able to organise a general strike. Here in the UK and in Australia, we have Labor governments, and who have been steadfast in their support of Israel, and they're steadfast in their suppression of Palestinian voices and pro-Palestinian resistance. In my university, we aren't even allowed to have posters on our wall supporting Palestinians and opposing genocide. They've been ripped off. I was in my office yesterday. My poster has been ripped off the door. There's an explicit policy led by our Vice Chancellor to remove pro-Palestinian posters from academic staff doors. We've seen the treatment of people who have been supporting Palestine Action with little pieces of paper. They sit down, the protesters sit down. It's the quietest protest, most dignified protest you can possibly imagine. And what their posters say, their little pieces of A4 paper say, we support Palestine Action, we oppose genocide. For that, they've been arrested. Over 3,000 people have been arrested and are clogging our courts. The police have to arrest people who want to be arrested. They're not arresting people who don't want to be arrested. It's insane. We're living in an Alice in Wonderland deranged society, where people who oppose mass violence are being arrested and people who support mass violence are being supported. So it's hard. It's hard to know where to go. We live in a world where the senseless makes sense. I don't know where we move from here in some senses, but we have to keep fighting. I do know that. I think that we have to fight our own governments. We have to organise. But in the UK, we've seen the trade union movement very quiescent. And I think what you're suggesting is the way forward. But I'm not sure how we get there, David. I think that, we are over 2 years into the worst possible crimes that states have committed. And they're emboldened. They aren't trying to hide their crimes. So we have to somehow think of ways to both shame our governments, but to prevent them from supporting a genocidal state.
Well, I can assure you that the movement here in Australia will keep fighting. I'm sure the same in Britain, and we can guarantee sumud and resistance on the part of the Palestinians. I think we can take some comfort from the fact that the world movement for Palestine is larger than it has ever been in our lifetimes. And both of us have seen very small mobilisations for Palestine in the past, and now we're seeing gigantic mobilisations. So let's keep up the fight. I know you will too. Yes. And thank you very much for your time today.
It's a pleasure, David. Thank you.